At exactly 12:03 a.m. on March 18, 2023, inside the 29th floor Executive Operations Center of Verexon Global in Manhattan, New York, beneath the artificial glow of recessed ceiling panels and surrounded by massive digital dashboards streaming live financial data, a janitor in a navy blue maintenance uniform pressed a single key on a keyboard that did not belong to him, and within 60 seconds, the company's projected quarterly revenue jumped from $48 million to $96.4 million. The room fell silent. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the city pulsed with midnight energy. Yellow taxis moved like restless veins through the streets below. Rain streaked down the skyscraper's mirrored exterior. Inside the operations center, senior executives who had been arguing just moments earlier froze in disbelief as green numbers flooded the financial dashboard screens. Projected revenue forecast, plus 100.8%. The CFO's hand, which had been gripping a stress ball moments earlier, dropped to the table. The chief revenue officer leaned forward so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. The CEO, Eleanor Kincaid, stared at the screen as though reality itself had malfunctioned. And standing near the terminal, breathing steadily but visibly shaken, was Miguel Alvarez, the night janitor. But to understand how a man hired to empty trash bins ended up transforming a billion-dollar company's financial trajectory in less than 1 minute, we have to rewind to when no one in that building even knew his name. Verexon Global was not a struggling startup. It was a mature enterprise software company specializing in supply chain automation and predictive sales analytics for mid-sized retail chains. For over a decade, it had grown steadily, comfortably, and safely. But by early 2023, safety had turned into stagnation. Revenue had plateaued for 6 consecutive quarters. Competitors were introducing aggressive AI-driven pricing models. Investors were losing patience. Internal morale was collapsing quietly. The official narrative blamed market conditions. The real problem was complacency. Miguel Alvarez began working at Verexon in 2021 after his consulting firm collapsed during the post-pandemic economic contraction. Before that collapse, Miguel had built optimization systems for e-commerce platforms across Latin America. He understood dynamic pricing, conversion funnels, customer behavior modeling, and margin elasticity better than most executives understood their own compensation packages. But when funding dried up and his Visa sponsorship dissolved, he accepted the only immediate job available, night custodial staff. He told himself it was temporary. At first, he kept his head down. He cleaned conference rooms where strategy decks projected future ambitions that felt disconnected from data reality. He wiped down glass boards covered in ambitious revenue targets that were never achieved. He vacuumed carpets in executive hallways while overhearing tense conversations about churn rates and declining client renewals. He did not intend to interfere. But Miguel had a habit he could not suppress. He paid attention. Every night, after most employees left, the Executive Operations Center remained partially active. Large wall-mounted dashboards displayed real-time sales performance, regional breakdowns, subscription metrics, and predictive forecasts generated by Verexon's internal revenue modeling software. It was designed to project growth trends based on historical purchasing behavior and contract renewals. Miguel noticed something unsettling almost immediately. The model treated pricing adjustments as static variables. It did not account for behavioral elasticity in real time. When subscription prices increased, the forecast assumed churn would follow predictable historical patterns. But the market had shifted dramatically in the last 2 years. Customers were no longer behaving predictably. Small discounts at the right moment triggered disproportionate retention spikes. Micro-adjustments during seasonal dips could unlock dormant purchasing cycles. The system Verexon relied on to forecast revenue was blind to opportunity. Miguel wrestled with whether he should say anything. A janitor suggesting strategic pricing reform to a company with a 7-figure analytics budget sounded absurd. He imagined the ridicule, the dismissal, the humiliation. So he stayed silent. But silence has weight. By February 2023, Verexon's board had scheduled an emergency strategy summit. Layoffs were being discussed quietly. Investor pressure intensified. The CEO, Eleanor Kincaid, known for her composed exterior and surgical decision-making, began spending late nights in the operations center reviewing reports. Miguel saw exhaustion on her face as she stared at declining charts long after midnight. One evening, while replacing trash liners near the executive workstation, Miguel overheard a heated argument between the CFO and the head of product. They debated whether to implement a blanket 12% subscription price increase across all tiers to compensate for stagnant growth. Miguel felt a surge of disbelief. A blanket increase would likely accelerate churn in vulnerable segments while barely impacting premium tier stability. It was a blunt instrument applied to a delicate ecosystem. That night, Miguel went home to his modest apartment in Queens and reopened an old laptop he had not used in months. He recreated a simplified version of Verexon's revenue model from memory, based on the dashboard structures he observed nightly. He layered in dynamic elasticity modeling, incorporating conditional pricing adjustments triggered by user engagement metrics and renewal probability thresholds. He ran simulations. The results were staggering. By shifting from static annual pricing reviews to adaptive, micro-adjusted subscription incentives based on real-time behavioral scoring, revenue projections did not merely improve, they doubled within specific segments. Churn decreased in lower tiers while upsell conversions increased in mid-tier clients. Miguel's hands trembled. He repeated the simulation 10 times. The pattern held. For weeks, he debated whether to present his findings. He drafted emails he never sent. He considered anonymously mailing a report. He even contemplated quitting altogether to avoid watching what he believed would become a preventable collapse. Then came March 17, 2023. At 10:40 p.m., an emergency executive meeting was called. The board had rejected the proposed blanket price increase. Instead, they demanded a radical growth strategy within 72 hours or face shareholder intervention. The atmosphere inside the operations center that night felt like a pressure chamber. Miguel stood at the edge of the room, invisible as always, holding a mop handle while executives dissected charts projected across enormous screens. At 11:56 p.m., the chief revenue officer said something that shifted everything. If we can't double revenue trajectory by Q4, we become acquisition bait. That sentence pierced Miguel. Double revenue. He had seen it in his simulations. At 11:59 p.m., as tension escalated and voices overlapped, Miguel felt a clarity he could no longer ignore. He walked toward the terminal console used for scenario modeling. No one stopped him at first. They assumed he was cleaning nearby. Then he spoke. "I think I can show you something." The room reacted with confusion bordering on irritation. The CFO almost dismissed him instantly. But Eleanor Kincaid, exhausted yet curious, told security to stand down. Miguel connected his external drive. He imported his adaptive elasticity model into the company's forecasting interface. And at exactly 12:03 a.m., March 18, 2023, he executed the simulation. The numbers surged upward. Not from manipulation. Not from fantasy projections. From restructured logic. Projected revenue doubled. The silence that followed felt historic. Miguel stepped back slowly, as though unsure whether he had just secured his future or destroyed it. Because in corporate hierarchies, brilliance from the wrong source can be as threatening as incompetence. Eleanor Kincaid finally spoke, her voice steady but heavy with implication. "Who are you? If this moment already has you questioning how many overlooked voices exist inside powerful institutions, take a second to reflect and engage with the story, because what happened next was not applause, it was suspicion." Miguel was not escorted out of the building. He was escorted into the executive conference room. And what unfolded behind those closed glass doors would determine whether Verexon Global rose into historic profitability or imploded under internal politics and ego. At 12:11 a.m. on March 18, 2023, inside conference room Atlas on the 29th floor of Verexon Global's Manhattan headquarters, beneath recessed lighting that cast sharp reflections across a 12-foot obsidian table, Miguel Alvarez sat across from 7 executives whose combined compensation exceeded $12 million annually. Outside the glass walls, The operations center still glowed with live dashboards streaming the simulation results he had triggered minutes earlier. Inside the room, however, the temperature had shifted from shock to scrutiny. The CEO, Eleanor Kincaid, remained standing rather than sitting, a subtle signal that this was not yet acceptance but interrogation. The CFO adjusted his glasses and reopened the forecasting dashboard on a secondary screen, rerunning Miguel's model with alternate data inputs as though attempting to catch it in a lie. The chief revenue officer crossed his arms, studying Miguel not as a janitor, but as a variable. Miguel felt the weight of hierarchy pressing against his chest, yet he refused to shrink into apology. He knew what he had built. He knew what the numbers meant. But he also understood that data does not automatically dismantle pride. The CFO was the first to speak, his tone controlled but edged with disbelief. He asked Miguel to explain, in detail, how his adaptive pricing logic differed from Verexon's existing revenue model. Miguel did not rush his response. He described how the current system treated churn risk as a lagging indicator, adjusting pricing only after customer behavior signaled withdrawal. His model inverted that logic. Instead of reacting to churn, it anticipated elasticity thresholds by analyzing micro-engagement signals, login frequency, feature utilization depth, billing cycle interaction timing, and applied conditional incentives before dissatisfaction solidified. He spoke in complete, deliberate paragraphs, mapping behavioral economics to algorithmic execution. The executives listened, and for the first time that night, no one interrupted. Eleanor finally asked the question that carried more danger than admiration. How did you access enough information to build this? Miguel answered honestly. He had not accessed confidential code bases or internal servers. He had reconstructed the system based on public-facing product logic, dashboard structures visible during late-night cleaning shifts, and years of prior experience building revenue optimization frameworks. The silence that followed was not relief. It was realization. The company's strategic thinking had been visible enough for an outsider inside the building to reverse engineer it. The chief legal officer cleared her throat, subtly steering the conversation toward risk mitigation. If Miguel's model worked as projected, it could redefine the company's trajectory. But if implemented recklessly, it could also destabilize client relationships or trigger compliance scrutiny in regulated markets. Doubling projected revenue overnight was intoxicating. Sustaining it was another matter. Miguel leaned forward slightly and acknowledged that truth before anyone could weaponize it against him. He explained that the simulation did not assume aggressive price hikes. It relied on micro-adjustments, sometimes offering targeted discounts to high-risk clients while simultaneously nudging high-engagement accounts toward premium tiers through feature bundling rather than price inflation. The revenue growth came not from squeezing customers, but from precision. That distinction shifted the tone in the room. At 1:02 a.m., the CEO ordered a controlled internal test. A small client segment representing 3% of annual revenue would be migrated into a sandbox deployment of Miguel's adaptive pricing logic. No public announcement, no investor briefing, just data. Miguel expected to be dismissed afterward, perhaps thanked quietly and told to return to maintenance duties while the professionals handled it. Instead, Eleanor instructed him to remain on the floor. "Stay," she said. "You built it. You monitor it." That word, stay, carried more emotional force than applause. If you are watching this story unfold and recognizing how quickly circumstances can pivot when courage meets preparation, take a moment to reflect on how many opportunities are buried beneath fear of speaking up. Stories like this remind us that timing can redefine identity, and your engagement with narratives like these helps bring more of them to light. By 3:30 a.m., the sandbox deployment was live. Miguel stood beside the head of data engineering, who initially treated him with restrained skepticism. Together they monitored conversion metrics as the adaptive triggers activated across the selected client pool. Early indicators were subtle, slightly increased renewal confirmations in accounts flagged as high risk, reduced downgrade activity among mid-tier subscriptions, incremental upsell clicks in accounts previously dormant. The CFO watched in silence from behind them. At 6 a.m., as the first wave of East Coast clients began logging into their dashboards for the business day, engagement spiked. The system adjusted in real time, offering tailored contract extensions and usage-based incentives precisely when behavioral signals peaked. Revenue projections recalibrated dynamically on the executive screen. By 9:12 a.m., preliminary live data mirrored the simulation curve. Projected quarterly revenue did not just hold, it expanded. But success rarely travels without resistance. By mid-morning, word had spread internally that the Janitor was involved in a confidential revenue experiment. Slack channels buzzed with speculation. Some employees celebrated the Underdog narrative, framing Miguel as proof that innovation is not confined to titles. Others felt threatened. Years of strategic planning had failed to produce growth, and now an outsider had achieved in hours what departments had not achieved in quarters. Ego does not evaporate simply because numbers improve. At 11:30 a.m., the Chief Revenue Officer requested a closed-door conversation with Eleanor. He argued that elevating Miguel too quickly could destabilize leadership credibility. Investors, he warned, might interpret the situation as evidence that executive oversight had been insufficient. There was also the matter of precedent. If a janitor could influence pricing architecture, what message did that send about organizational competence? Eleanor listened without interruption. She had built her reputation on decisive pragmatism, not sentimental optics. When she responded, her voice was steady. "The only message that matters," she said, "is whether revenue grows." Meanwhile, Miguel sat alone in a temporary workstation overlooking the Hudson River, staring at live dashboards that continued to trend upward. The emotional weight of the moment pressed into him in waves. Only weeks earlier, he had feared being laid off from a job he was overqualified for. Now he was holding the lever of transformation. Yet beneath the rising numbers, he sensed a deeper tension. At 2:47 p.m., the legal team flagged a potential complication. Certain regions under strict pricing transparency regulations might interpret adaptive microdiscounts as discriminatory if not communicated properly. Scaling the model globally required structural safeguards and disclosure strategies. The path forward was not as simple as flipping a switch. By 5 p.m., the initial sandbox segment had generated a 17% increase in projected annualized revenue from that micro-cohort alone. If extrapolated responsibly across larger segments, the doubling forecast was not fantasy. But then something happened that no one anticipated. At 6:22 p.m., a mid-tier client from the sandbox pool emailed the company's support desk questioning why their renewal offer differed from a peer company's rate. The message was polite but pointed. Transparency cracks begin small. The head of customer relations forwarded the email to the executive chain. Miguel read it twice. The adaptive model had worked exactly as designed. But perception can distort precision. If clients began comparing notes publicly, the strategy could be misinterpreted as opportunistic manipulation rather than behavioral optimization. Inside the executive suite, tension returned. Doubling revenue overnight was possible. Sustaining it without triggering backlash was uncertain. Eleanor turned to Miguel and asked the question that would define not just the company's profits, but its ethical identity. "If this scales," she said, "can you defend it publicly?" Miguel knew that answering yes meant stepping into scrutiny far beyond spreadsheets. It meant attaching his name, his face, and his story to a strategy that could either become a case study in innovation or a headline in controversy. The dashboards continued climbing. The client email sat unanswered. And the entire future of Verexon global balanced between acceleration and exposure. On October 17, 2023, at exactly 6:42 a.m., inside the executive boardroom on the 48th floor of Argentum Technologies' glass headquarters in downtown Chicago, a silence so heavy it felt violent filled the room. Outside, the skyline shimmered under a pale sunrise, but inside, every eye was fixed on the massive digital dashboard projected against the far wall. The numbers were no longer bleeding red. They were glowing green. Revenue had not only stabilized, it had surged. Overnight, inbound sales had multiplied. Subscription renewals had spiked by 41%. A dormant client segment had reactivated in less than 12 hours. The CFO, who had barely slept in weeks, adjusted his glasses twice, thinking the system was malfunctioning. It was not. The CO stood slowly, his hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from something far more disorienting, hope. And at the far end of the polished oak table, seated where janitors were never meant to sit, was Marcus Hale. The same man security had nearly escorted out of the building just 2 weeks earlier. The same man executives had laughed at. The same man who, just months before, was quietly emptying their trash cans while memorizing their mistakes. If you have ever underestimated someone or have ever been underestimated yourself, this is the moment that will stay with you. And if this story is already pulling you in, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you never miss the lessons hidden in stories like this. Because what happened next inside that boardroom would permanently redefine leadership at Argentum Technologies. But to truly understand how revenue doubled overnight, you need to understand what Marcus did after the CEO reluctantly gave him 72 hours. 72 hours to prove he was not delusional. 72 hours to save a company drowning in its own arrogance. Marcus did not go home that night. After walking out of the executive office with conditional approval to test his strategy, he went straight to the lowest level of the building, the quiet IT operations floor where the servers hummed like distant thunder. It was ironic. For years, he had worked in silence beneath the noise of power. Now, he would build in silence beneath the panic of executives. He had been studying Argentum's numbers for months. While scrubbing conference tables and vacuuming hallways after midnight, he would glance at whiteboards filled with half-erased projections. He would see marketing funnels scribbled in dry erase marker. He would notice contradictions in strategy decks carelessly left open on screens. What executives considered classified information was often simply left unattended. But Marcus was not stealing secrets. He was studying patterns. The problem was never the product. Argentum's flagship AI analytics platform was superior to its competitors in technical capability. It processed data faster. It delivered deeper predictive modeling. The engineers had built something brilliant. The tragedy was that the company had forgotten who they built it for. Marcus had noticed something during his nightly shifts that none of the executives had noticed during their quarterly meetings. Customer support tickets were increasing, not because the product failed, but because clients did not understand how to use it. Tutorials were outdated. Onboarding was rushed. Smaller businesses felt intimidated by the complexity. The marketing department, obsessed with enterprise clients, had abandoned the mid-sized companies that once fueled steady revenue growth. Marcus saw a gap. A massive one. Instead of chasing new mega contracts, what if they reactivated the thousands of smaller clients who had quietly drifted away? What if they simplified onboarding? What if they created an automated quick start dashboard that gave immediate, visible wins within the first 24 hours of subscription? Executives had been hunting whales. Marcus wanted to build a school of fish. And that shift would change everything. Over the next 72 hours, Marcus worked alongside a junior developer named Priya Desai, one of the few engineers who believed in him after overhearing fragments of his proposal. Priya had grown frustrated watching leadership ignore user experience feedback. She saw in Marcus not just intelligence, but empathy, something the boardroom lacked. Together, they built a simplified onboarding interface layered over the existing product. It did not replace the core system, it translated it. They designed automated walkthroughs tailored to 3 primary industries. They integrated a results preview simulator that showed potential ROI projections before clients even uploaded full datasets. They reactivated an email list of dormant accounts with a message that felt human rather than corporate. We built something simpler. Let us prove it. Marcus wrote most of that email himself. It did not contain buzzwords. It did not boast about disruption or industry dominance. It acknowledged frustration. It apologized for complexity. It invited customers back without pride. That email alone would generate 18,000 clicks in 12 hours. But here's where tension rose again. At 2:13 a.m., on the final night before the 72-hour window closed, the internal analytics dashboard began to spike. Server load increased beyond projections. IT alerted upper management that an unexpected wave of logins was hitting the platform. Panic spread. Executives feared a system breach or cyber attack. They did not know Marcus had already launched the reactivation campaign. By the time the sun began to rise, the numbers told a story no one could deny. Thousands of previously inactive accounts were re-engaging. Trial upgrades converted at a rate triple the historical average. Subscription renewals that were months overdue suddenly processed automatically. And that is how we returned to 6:42 a.m. in the boardroom. The CFO cleared his throat. This cannot be real. But it was. Projected revenue for the quarter had jumped by 102% compared to forecasted decline. The room, once filled with doubt, now carried something else. Confusion mixed with reluctant admiration. The CEO turned toward Marcus slowly. His voice, once dismissive, now trembled with a different tone. How? Marcus did not smile arrogantly. He did not lean back triumphantly. He spoke quietly. You stopped listening to your customers. I listened. Those words landed harder than any financial metric, because they exposed a truth deeper than numbers. Argentum had not been losing money due to competition. It had been losing connection. But triumph did not mean acceptance. Power structures do not crumble overnight, even when revenue doubles. Within hours of the announcement, whispers began spreading through the executive floor. Some praised Marcus as a visionary. Others questioned security protocols. How did a janitor access data? Who authorized him? Was this sustainable or just a short-term spike? One board member privately suggested that giving Marcus credit would undermine senior leadership credibility. The tension thickened. Marcus could feel it. Success is often celebrated publicly and resented privately. And as much as the numbers validated his strategy, he knew the real battle had just begun, not to prove intelligence, but to challenge ego. If you are still watching, ask yourself this question in the comments. Would you have given Marcus a chance in the first place? Stories like this remind us how often potential hides in plain sight. And if you believe in recognizing overlooked talent, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story that challenges conventional thinking. Because what happened next inside Argentum Technologies was not a clean victory. It became a test of character. Later that afternoon, the CEO called an emergency shareholder meeting. News of the revenue spike had already begun leaking into industry circles. Analysts speculated about a sudden acquisition or secret contract. Stock prices, which had been declining steadily, began climbing. The CEO faced a decision that would define his legacy. He could present the success as a collective strategic pivot orchestrated by senior leadership, or he could tell the truth. In a room filled with investors and cameras, under the harsh glow of financial scrutiny, he stepped to the podium. For a moment he hesitated. Marcus stood off to the side, still wearing the same modest blazer he had borrowed for the boardroom meeting. His janitor badge remained clipped discreetly inside his pocket, as if he refused to erase where he came from. The CEO inhaled deeply. Then he spoke. Our revenue turnaround was initiated by an employee most of us overlooked. Gasps rippled through the audience. He is not an executive. He is not a director. He is part of our custodial staff. The room fell silent. In that silence, something shifted, not just at Argentum, but in perception itself. Marcus stepped forward. Cameras flashed. And for the first time in his life, the man who once cleaned conference tables stood behind a microphone addressing shareholders. But before he could speak, a board member interrupted. Before we celebrate, we need to discuss liability. The words sliced through the momentum like a blade. Because beneath admiration still lived fear. And that fear would spark a confrontation that threatened to erase everything Marcus had built in 72 hours. The battle was no longer about revenue. It was about power. And power rarely surrenders quietly. As the shareholder meeting spiraled into debate over process, access, and corporate hierarchy, Marcus realized something painful. Doubling revenue was easier than dismantling pride. He faced a choice. Stay silent and allow executives to reshape the narrative. Or speak truth, even if it cost him everything. What he said next would determine whether he remained a janitor or became something far greater. And that moment, standing under blinding lights in front of investors who once would have never looked twice at him, is where part 3 closes. Because the next decision would not just impact Marcus's career. It would expose whether Argentum Technologies truly valued results or merely titles. The silence inside the shareholder auditorium felt suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and forces you to confront who you truly are. The interruption from the board members still lingered in the air like smoke after an explosion. Investors shifted in their seats. Cameras remained fixed. Financial analysts leaned forward, hungry for drama. And Marcus Hale stood at the podium, not as a janitor anymore, not yet as an executive, but as something far more dangerous to the established order, a man with proof. The board member's voice had carried sharp authority when he mentioned liability, compliance, and internal protocol violations. It was not entirely unreasonable. Corporate systems are designed to prevent chaos, not invite it. But beneath the language of governance was something far more fragile: ego. If a janitor could fix what executives could not, what did that say about the executives? Marcus felt it. The tension was not about legality. It was about pride. He leaned into the microphone, his hands steady despite the storm around him. His voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It carried the quiet clarity of someone who had already faced humiliation and survived it. "I did not hack the system," he began calmly. "I used access granted to every employee to observe customer behavior patterns that were already available internally. I did not override leadership. I responded to neglect." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. He did not attack anyone. He did not accuse the board. He spoke about customers, small business owners who had once believed in Argentum, who had written emails asking for help, who had quietly canceled subscriptions because they felt ignored. He described a bakery owner in Ohio who struggled to interpret analytics dashboards. He mentioned a logistics startup in Arizona that stopped using the platform because onboarding felt overwhelming. These were not billion-dollar corporations. They were everyday entrepreneurs trying to survive. And when they left, Marcus said softly, "We did not even notice." Those words hurt more than any accusation. Because they were true. If this moment is making you reflect on leadership, on humility, on the dangers of ignoring small voices, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Stories like this are not just about business. They are about the cost of arrogance and the power of empathy. And what happens next will test whether success alone can change a culture rooted in hierarchy. The CEO watched Marcus carefully. There was no anger in his eyes now. There was recognition, perhaps even regret. But the board was divided. One faction argued that Marcus's initiative demonstrated exactly the kind of internal innovation the company desperately needed. Another faction feared that rewarding him would signal to employees that protocol was optional. They framed it as governance. They framed it as risk management. But beneath their polished language was a simpler truth. They had been outperformed by someone they had once overlooked. And then the unexpected happened. Priya Desai stood up. She was not scheduled to speak. She was not a board member. She was a mid-level developer who had quietly collaborated with Marcus during those 72 hours. But she walked to the front with a composure that silenced even the loudest skeptic. "With respect," she began, "if we are discussing liability, we should also discuss accountability. We have ignored user feedback for over a year. We have deprioritized mid-tier clients in favor of high-risk enterprise contracts that never materialized. Marcus did not break protocol. He fixed our blind spot." The room shifted again. Sometimes transformation does not come from a single voice, but from the courage of two. The CFO cleared his throat and projected updated analytics onto the massive screen behind them. The revenue spike was not a fluke. Retention rates were stabilizing. Customer engagement metrics had tripled. Support tickets were decreasing because the simplified onboarding interface was working. Analysts in the room began recalculating projections on their tablets. Numbers do not lie. And now, they were on Marcus's side. But success always carries a cost. Within hours of the shareholder meeting, industry media outlets began publishing headlines, "Janitor saves tech firm from collapse." Social media erupted with praise. Some called it inspirational. Others questioned how a custodial employee had access to strategic data. Online forums dissected Argentum's internal structure. Competitors watched closely. And inside the company, something even more volatile was brewing. Not everyone celebrated. Several senior executives felt exposed. Their previous strategies were now under scrutiny. Emails from months earlier resurfaced, warnings about declining mid-tier engagement that had been dismissed. Internal alliances began fracturing. Some executives quietly blamed the CEO for allowing the situation to escalate this far. Others blamed Marcus for disrupting the chain of command. Marcus returned to his usual shift that evening. Yes, even after doubling revenue overnight. He pushed his cleaning cart down the same quiet hallway where executives once walked past him without eye contact. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly. The building felt different now, but the floor tiles still needed mopping. And that image, Marcus in his janitor uniform hours after addressing shareholders, would later become symbolic inside Argentum, because humility cannot be staged. Late that night, as he emptied trash bins near the executive offices, the CEO approached him. There were no cameras, no investors, no applause. Just two men standing in a quiet corridor. "You should not be doing this anymore," the CEO said softly. Marcus paused. "It's honest work." "I know," the CEO replied. "But you've proven you can do more." This was the crossroads. Promoting Marcus would not just elevate one man. It would redefine corporate culture. It would challenge long-standing assumptions about talent pipelines, educational pedigree, and organizational hierarchy. It would send a message that results mattered more than titles. But it would also anger powerful people. And powerful people rarely forgive disruption. If you have ever faced a moment where opportunity collided with resistance, where your growth threatened someone else's comfort, you know how fragile these turning points can be. Let us know in the comments if you would have accepted a leadership role after everything Marcus endured. And if you value stories that expose real human struggles behind corporate headlines, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Because the final decision was not announced immediately. The board scheduled an emergency closed-door session. For 6 hours, they debated. They analyzed risk. They projected public relations impact. They reviewed internal policy. Some argued that promoting Marcus would appear reactive. Others argued that failing to do so would appear hypocritical. Meanwhile, employees across departments whispered about change. For the first time in years, morale surged. Not because revenue doubled, but because someone without a prestigious title had been heard. Near midnight, the board reached a vote. The CEO called Marcus back to the 48th floor. The same boardroom where he once sat awkwardly at the far end of the table now felt strangely familiar. The skyline outside was dark, dotted with city lights that flickered like quiet witnesses to history. The CEO stood. Effective immediately, he announced, Marcus Hale is appointed Director of Customer Strategy and Innovation. Not Vice President. Not Chief Officer. Director. A title significant enough to influence direction, yet measured enough to calm dissent. It was a compromise. But it was also a beginning. Marcus did not celebrate wildly. He did not boast. He simply nodded. Because for him, this was never about status. It was about listening. Over the following months, Argentum transformed its internal culture. Customer feedback sessions became mandatory for executives. Simplified product pathways expanded. Mid-tier clients once abandoned became the backbone of recurring revenue stability. The company's stock rebounded. Industry analysts cited the turnaround as a case study in adaptive leadership. And yet, perhaps the most profound transformation was invisible. Executives began noticing employees they once overlooked. Ideas from unexpected departments received consideration. Meetings felt less insulated. Hierarchy did not disappear, but it softened. Marcus kept his janitor badge. Not because he needed it, but because it reminded him of where clarity is often found. In quiet observation, not loud authority. The story of Argentum Technologies would later be taught in business schools as an example of bottom-up innovation. But the true lesson was simpler than any corporate framework. Genius does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it empties the trash beside it. And sometimes, the person no one notices is the one paying the most attention. If this story moved you, challenged your thinking, or reminded you never to underestimate yourself or someone else, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that leadership is not granted by title, it is proven by impact. Because somewhere, in some company right now, another Marcus Hale is quietly watching. And the only question is, will anyone listen?